Pleasant afternoon, everyone. I am Tan. I am an ISOG executive, and I am honored to host your breakout session. I am excited right now because it will surely be another afternoon filled with learnings and insights for all of us. We have a lineup of relevant topics that will be discussed to us by thought leaders in the field of cybersecurity. The first in our roster of speakers is a tandem from Darktrace, a world-leading AI cybersecurity company. They will be talking about how self-learning AI surgically contains the threat. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Darktrace Director of Cyber Intelligence and Analytics, Justin Fier, and Darktrace Director of Analysis, Brianna Leddy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Justin Fier, Director of Cyber Intelligence and Analytics, and I'm joined by my colleague Brianna Leddy, Director of Analysis. And today we are going to focus on ransomware, as if you haven't heard enough about ransomware in these last few weeks, years, whatever. But we're going to talk specifically about how AI can surgically contain ransomware, in some cases in less than a minute. So we're going to talk about what ransomware looks like today and actually show you some real live use cases. But before that, let's talk about who Darktrace is. So Darktrace was founded in 2013 by mathematicians. We're headquartered in Cambridge, UK, and I'm proud to say that we are the fastest growing cybersecurity company, according to Financial Times 2020 report. More importantly, we are the first to market with artificial intelligence for comprehensive cyber defense. And we are also the creators of autonomous response technology, which we are going to focus on today. So let's talk a little bit about the threat landscape that we're all living in today. Now, we are rounding the corner, I hope, of reopening the world and getting back to a little bit of a sense of normal. But because of what we've all gone through in the last year and a half, the threat landscape looks very different than it did as recently as 2 years ago. So let's first start with just a really fascinating quote from Forrester. This new era of offensive AI leverages various forms of machine learning to supercharge cyber attacks, resulting in unpredictable, contextualized, speedier, and stealthier assaults that can cripple unprotected organizations. Now, let's look back just in the last few months. We saw the SolarWinds supply chain attack, the Hafnium exchange compromise, recently the Colonial Pipeline attack, which I have to say I had to sit on gas lines for a few days feeling the effects of that. And so it should come as no surprise that the threat landscape is getting even more unpredictable than before. And this quote from Forrester is so important because I think a lot of folks don't realize that offensive AI, the opposite of what Darktrace is doing, is on the very near horizon. And in some cases, it's actually already here. Threat actors are using machine learning and AI and natural language processing to make their spear phishing campaigns more realistic, duping even the most experienced practitioners into clicking the links on their phishing. And so let's talk a little bit about why the threat landscape is different. Obviously, remote work has created a lot of new threat vectors for us. And unless you've been living under a rock or in some part of the world not affected by what we've all been going through, you yourself are probably remote working as well. And I'm excited that we are starting to open things back up again, but that hybrid remote work environment is probably here to stay for quite some time. And it's really opened up some additional attack vectors. Additionally, our networks are more disparate than ever. We're using cloud and SaaS more than we ever were before. Digital transformation was literally accelerated overnight when the pandemic hit. We're relying more on collaboration tools. Email is still the most porous point of our network. And our networks are getting more complex, not simpler. And we need to think about that when thinking about providing a security or autonomous response aspect to it. Now, this is an interesting statistic. 86% of industry professionals believe that AI-powered attacks are going to become mainstream. And I actually think that number is even on the lower side. I think if you did that poll this summer at some of the big security conferences, we probably have seen that creep up just in the last few weeks. And then last but not least, there's a lot of geopolitical tension still occurring around the globe, and nation state attacks are not going anywhere. You know, again, not to sound like a broken record, but there has been attribution to nation states on just some of those big attacks that we've seen in the last 6 months. And it should come as no surprise that nation states are still developing new techniques and tradecraft to take their attacks even further. So ransomware, what is it? Now, believe it or not, not all ransomware is treated equal. There is actually a lot of different types of ransomware out there. And so some of this might be review for some of you, but some of you might not have ever even heard of this. And so first and foremost, double threat ransomware is becoming a major problem recently. We've seen just in the last few months some big corporations not only getting hit with that ransom, but also being threatened with dumping sensitive information. And in double threat ransomware cases, the attacker not only infiltrates the network and sets up their payload and gets the stage ready for encrypting all the devices, but before doing so, they actually exfiltrate data from the network. It's a second form of blackmail, so to speak, for the attackers to use against the victim in hopes of pressuring them even more so into paying. Now, that's a topic for another day, the morals or the decision, should we even pay these criminals after all? But double threat ransomware is absolutely on the rise. And myself and Brianna are actually going to show you a couple real world use cases of that later on in today's presentation. Legacy ransomware is just what it sounds like. It's the old school ransomware that we're all familiar with, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon either. It's getting smarter and it's getting more sophisticated, but more importantly, I'm finding the attackers are getting more brazen, attacking things like hospitals and school systems, and really just anybody they can get their hands on. And then last but not least, we've got lower level threat actors renting ransomware as a service. And you heard me mention that Colonial Pipeline attack earlier. This is a great example of it. That DarkSide group is a perfect example of it. They run a ransomware, or I should say they did run a ransomware as a service program where you could essentially rent their platform. And in some of these criminal organizations, believe it or not, they even offer 24/7 help desks. It really is business to these criminals in what they are doing. And last but not least, increased internet-facing attack surface. That last slide, the new digital landscape we work on means we've really increased that digital footprint to the internet-facing surface. And we are seeing RDP being exploited left and right. Now, not exploited in the traditional sense. This doesn't mean there's an O-day or a vulnerability there. We're seeing folks literally come in through the front door or brute force these RDP protocols that are either accidentally or intentionally exposed to the internet. And I think you'll start to see that trend in some of the examples that Brianna and I are going to show you later on. So this one's a really important one before I pass the baton over to Brianna. Ransomware, the costs. Now, it doesn't come as any surprise. We've seen just in the last week ransoms being paid in the sums of $4.1 million from Colonial, $40 million from a major insurance provider. These are not small sums of number. So just to throw some numbers out you, in Q4 2019, and I apologize, I'll have to dig up some 2020 stats for you, but there was a 104% average increase in ransom payment. Now, the scary thing there is, if that was Q4 2019, I can only imagine what 2021 is already off to. We also saw $133,000 average cost of ransomware attacks per business. Now that's important, per business. And then last but not least, $8,100 average cost of ransomware per incident. Now, I want you to think about that. Some of you listening are not major Fortune 500 publicly traded companies with massive amounts of resources. Some of you are small and medium businesses, and just an average cost of $133,000 can really take a chunk out of your revenue stream. These are not small numbers to bat an eye at. We really need to take this serious. And as I mentioned before, this is Q4 2019. The numbers are just going up and they're moving up at an exponential pace. So with that, I want to pass it on to Brianna to talk a little bit about what Darktrace's autonomous response is doing for our customers and how we can help you guys.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. And so all of these trends that Justin just spoke about really highlight the need for self-learning AI, right? And the benefit of this approach is that it learns directly from an environment rather than relying on existing rules or requiring extensive setup. You know, it's no surprise that legacy security systems just can't keep up with the new pace of ransomware, as attackers are constantly trying to, generate new mutations and try new tactics in order to get into an environment. So with self-learning AI, this learns what normal looks like for devices and users across the whole enterprise. And in this, it establishes a sense of self so that it's able to differentiate what's normal activity and what's anomalous that may indicate a threat to the environment. Self-learning AI, it can be applied to all types of environments, from the traditional network to SaaS applications, and even industrial systems. And we'll cover a case study today that goes through kind of that IT as well as industrial convergence. Through highlighting abnormal behavior, AI can identify new and emerging threats in real time. And that's such an important foundation. First of all, just to detect ransomware in an environment, but second, to respond to it. And so with that response, we take autonomous response based on the self-learning approach, just to detect potential threats. But moving beyond that, cyber AI can also be applied to autonomously respond to threats without requiring human confirmation. Our Antigena autonomous response technology is able to surgically interrupt attacks, taking precise and proportionate action in order to contain a threat without disrupting normal business activities. And it's really absolutely crucial that cyber AI can respond in seconds, keeping pace with the machine speed attacks that we're seeing today. Another factor that we haven't talked about in the recent trend of ransomware yet is out-of-hours attacks. Many of these attackers are deploying ransomware overnight or on weekends and holidays so that they can cause the most damage to an organization without them realizing it, without having eyes on your security systems as it's happening. And so cyber AI autonomous response is really about buying security teams time during an in-progress attack, stopping the attack in its steps, preventing it from spreading across the environment, and giving your security teams time to actually get in and respond and investigate. Autonomous response is all customizable and controllable based on your specific business needs and risk thresholds. And so I think that's an important thing to mention as we think about moving to autonomous response.
Now, Brianna, if I could just interrupt real quick, speed. We hear about that all the time. I don't know if folks realize, but it's been almost 3 years since NotPetya dropped. And there's an amazing article in Wired magazine that talks about the mere fact that it took out an entire global network for a major logistics firm in a matter of hours. And I want everybody listening to ask yourselves, do I even have hours to respond? And that is why this is so important to think about. We need to be talking in terms of seconds and nanoseconds, really.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Justin. And I think that also fits in well with kind of the third piece of the cyber AI puzzle. So fitting in with detection and response is our cyber AI analyst, which augments security teams by automating that investigation and triage stage. So cyber AI analyst does the heavy lifting of an investigation. I think, we're all familiar with investigations that are just time spent sifting through logs, looking for that needle in the haystack, and oftentimes, not coming up with anything of interest. But with the power of cyber AI, it's able to gain context and piece together large quantities of information at machine speed in order to reach conclusions about a potential threat, and then present that information to the security team, helping the security teams understand threats and also start from a place of information, giving them all of the technical details so that they are able to jump into the response and remediation stage. Cyber AI Analyst continually updates itself when new information is discovered, and it scales indefinitely. It isn't limited by the size of an organization or by the severity of an attack. And so in all of this, it saves security teams valuable time, reducing the time to triage by 92% and allowing teams to respond quickly to an attack. So coupled with autonomous response, which is stopping an attack in its tracks, Cyber AI Analyst is working alongside that to present a narrative of the attack, giving teams all of that technical information so that they can quickly respond to threats, such as some of the ransomware attacks that we'll dive into now. So with that, I will hand it back to Justin to discuss one of our first threat finds today.
Thank you, Brianna. That was great. So what I want everybody to think about as Brianna and I are going through all these is this is anomaly detection. We hear so much about how ransomware comes in through email and our employees click the link and it moves laterally, et cetera. But what I want to stress is all of these finds are being done without a single rule or signature. Darktrace has no presumption of what these different types of ransomware looked like before its detection, leading up to, etc. It's always based around the unusual thing that is always going to happen when something breaks into your network. And so let's first start with this first one with a 0-day ransomware, not so 0-day anymore because it's been caught. So first and foremost, we're going to go through all of these are going to be similar framework. Let's look at just some of the high level, pieces of information about this. First and foremost, ransomware, really not just ransomware, any malware really can be resignatured and mutated within a matter of seconds. And attackers know this. Believe it or not, attackers do test their software, we'll call it software, their tools against legacy or current day products to make sure that it can bypass those legacy controls that sadly some of us are still relying on heavily. And so we're seeing new mutations literally daily. In this particular case, the client was an international distributor here based in the US. And the initial infection was likely a phishing email. And that's a conversation for another day about anti-Gina email. But it came in, and the first thing we saw was a combination of unusual HTTP requests followed by suspicious SMB activity, and then some reverse DNS sweeps. Now, the most important piece here is the autonomous response took a measured action and it quarantined the infected device for a period of 24 hours. And what that did is it gave the security team vital time that they needed back to decide as a team what that course of action was going to be so that we could minimize any sort of damage to the network. So if you're not familiar with Darktrace, this is an actual screenshot from Darktrace. And this is what ransomware looks like from an anomaly detection standpoint. Now, in our industry, we call this lighting up like a Christmas tree. You can see all those little dots there, which show up as kind of blips, unusual things happening within this particular environment. Now, going through, you can see that big spike, it almost looks like an EKG at a hospital. You want to see that steady pattern, and then all of a sudden something occurred around this time. Now, in a busy network that's changing thousands of times per second with tons of different devices, that little blip can very easily get lost in the noise. But Darktrace's ability to spot that needle in a haystack and actually contextualize it is what makes it so powerful, both for the human end user and the autonomous response piece. And what I want to show you is literally at this very almost real time, at the same time of detecting the suspicious SMB activity, which is that final piece to the puzzle when the ransomware is trying to go out and read files and write them and add that encryption file type to it, send the ransom note, etc. We actually put an anti-Gina ransomware block. And what this means is instead of 100% of your network files getting potentially encrypted, maybe only 0.05% are getting actually encrypted. much easier to recover from a backup than, say, a network-wide encryption. And again, you can see there, the Antigena ransomware block occurred literally at the same exact time that we started to detect that unusual SMB activity. Now, the one piece I want to really focus on is that it wasn't just because it was the suspicious SMB activity. Darktrace looked at those other dots prior to it and pulled those in as a data point as well. And it looks at all of those different features and it decides, based on everything I'm seeing here, I have enough information that I think I should take an automated response and stop this. And Brianna, off to you. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this one. I'm going to let you go for that.
This one's always a bit of a tongue twister, but I will give it a chance. The Sunnokibi ransomware is our next threat find, also known as the REvil group. Maybe a little bit easier to say, but still not sure on the exact pronunciation there. The main thing about this group is they're one of the new popular double extortion threat actors, right? And Justin mentioned these as a new trend earlier, where they exfiltrate data before encrypting, and then they hold that data for ransom as well, threatening to release your sensitive company documents for auction, typically on the dark web. And we've seen Sunnokibi target multiple organizations in the US. And in this particular case that I'm going to talk through, we saw an IT credential being used to access a domain controller. I think this is an interesting piece that we see as part of the trend of attackers is abusing legitimate admin credentials or using those living off the land techniques, really trying to blend into what is maybe normal network activity. But of course, to Darktrace, we're able to see that it's not normal. Maybe it's occurring at an unusual time. Maybe it's unusual for that particular device to be using an IT credential or some of these admin tools. And so in this case, Darktrace had several different detections, saying this was anomalous activity for a server. Again, that suspicious SMB activity, unusual data transfer that was related to the data exfiltration. Through Cyber AI, Darktrace was able to provide real-time detections of every stage of this attack, as well as generate an incident summary. And let's dive into what these attack stages look like, because this was a fairly drawn out infection. So in this case, the initial compromise actually happened a few weeks before the ransomware was ever deployed in this environment. However, without autonomous response to step in and actually take action on these initial attack phases, the attack was able to go undetected for weeks. Following that initial compromise, the device started to slowly exfiltrate data, to make command and control connections to a rare IP address, and to perform some lateral movement, scanning the network and starting to move laterally using common admin tools. These were all slight deviations in the device's activity that may be difficult to pick up if you are a large enterprise looking at thousands of devices and users and their traffic. But Darktrace was able to highlight these deviations leading up to the eventual deployment of ransomware. And while we look at this timeline here, I think it's even more important to look at how Cyber AI Analyst responded to this. Very similar to the timeline on the previous slide, Cyber AI Analyst put together a timeline of all of the activity that occurred, from that unusual external data transfer, command and control, file encryption, as well as network scanning. All of the suspicious behavior was laid out for this device, providing a timeline as well as details for each event within this incident. So you can see here how Cyber AI Analyst reported on the command and control activity, giving a high-level summary so even non-technical users can understand what's occurring and why it represents a threat, as well as all of those technical details: source IP, destination IP, connection timestamps, data transfers, everything that we would need as security analysts to get in, find the devices of interest, and remediate this activity. So I think this just speaks to the power of Cyber AI in reporting and automating that triage and investigation, giving security teams a report to work with instead of just an alert that something is unusual. And now I want to move on to our last threat find, which again is going to deal with a double extortion ransomware group, but now targeting industrial systems. Similar to what Justin mentioned before, it's easy for malware and threat actors to change signatures in order to bypass legacy tools. And that was exactly the case here as well. This ransomware targeted a North American utility supplier with that IT and OT convergence. So both the industrial and enterprise systems were able to talk to each other. And this started on the enterprise side. So in that IT environment, a desktop device was compromised, likely by a phishing email, or again, one of those other threat vectors that we often see with ransomware, incoming RDP, or exploitation of a common vulnerability. Similar to the previous case, we saw a new admin credential being used on the device. We saw the device moving laterally via remote desktop. And we observed that file encryption, again, based on the behavior. We weren't looking for specific file extensions or specific hashes for the ransomware. We were looking at the behavior, seeing that an extension was being appended to an SMB file, which was highly unusual for that device and was happening in a large volume. This was able to generate high priority alerts. And so with that real-time detection, the ransomware was stopped on the IT side before it could spill over into the OT environment and cause much more damage. Just the recent events that we've seen just give evidence to how much damage could have been caused in this case. Again, taking a look at that timeline, we can see that initial compromised, followed by establishing a foothold. In this case, we saw a connection to a remote management tool in order to facilitate remote access by the attackers. We often see things like TeamViewer being used in these cases, again, trying to blend into normal network traffic. And there's often the fact that TeamViewer is not blocked by any of our systems because it is a legitimate remote access tool. As I mentioned, this was a double extortion type ransomware. So we saw that data exfiltration step, a large internal download followed by an immediate external upload to pCloud, a common file storage service. Once the exfiltration was complete, then the attackers were able to deploy the ransomware. And as you can see on the timeline here, this actually took place between 1 and 2 a.m. local time. Again, an out-of-hours attack where it was able to spread throughout the network while this particular security team did not have eyes on the activity. Still, once they were alerted to this, they were able to prevent it from spreading any further and getting into that industrial side of the environment. Again, Cyber AI Analyst is able to provide such critical information during these attacks, giving insight into what devices are involved, potential chains of communications that may go unnoticed by a stressed security team who are just trying to remediate and put out fires as they pop up through the environment. So with autonomous response taking action whenever possible to stop this activity, as was the case in the earlier example that Justin ran through, and Cyber AI Analysts to report on this activity, this is giving our teams a huge leg up to work to detect and respond to ransomware before it can cause significant damage to their environments. Back to you, Justin, for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. That was awesome. I always love hearing all those stories. With that, I wanted to point you guys to a couple resources. There's a lot of information on the Darktrace website, as well as on the Darktrace blog, specifically how AI stopped Wasted Locker before the ransomware was deployed. And there's a great YouTube video from my colleague Brianna about the Maze ransomware analysis. So please come check out all the amazing information from my colleagues on the Darktrace blog for more information about what we're doing in regards to ransomware. And I want to thank everybody today for spending some time with myself and Brianna to talk a little bit about what Darktrace is doing for ransomware. If you're interested on taking it out for a test drive, no pun intended, please feel free to visit us at info@darktrace.com to book a free 30-day proof of value, or just come find Brianna and me on LinkedIn if you want to chat about all things cyber and AI. Thank you again.